Part C. In this part of the test, you'll hear 2 different extracts. In each extract, you'll hear health professionals talking about aspects of their work. For questions 31 to 42, choose the answer A, B or C which fits best according to what you hear. Complete your answers as you listen. Now look at Extract 1. Extract 1, questions 31 to 36. You now have 90 seconds to read questions 31 to 36.
Stacey, I thought this article was really fascinating, not least because after years, maybe decades of debate on the downsides of medicine and overdiagnosis, it seems quite incredible that we don't quite know what we're talking about still. And you seem to have been working hard to really try and understand and define what too much medicine is. Can you set the scene for us a bit and tell us how you got into this and why it's important to try and define these concepts?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you know, Helen, this paper kind of started with a really interesting experience at the Second International Preventing Overdiagnosis Conference. We all talked about overdiagnosis animatedly for 3 days, and we had a sense of solidarity, and we agreed that this was a problem and it needed to be fixed. And then on the 4th day, there was a special invitation-only meeting of experts, so just people that were really engaged with research about overdiagnosis to try and set the research agenda for the next 12 months. And the very first session was called, I think, Nailing Down the Definition of Overdiagnosis. There was 2 hours devoted to this session. And so these are all people who've been thinking about overdiagnosis a lot. And it became apparent within the first 15 minutes that there was no way that we were going to nail down a definition of overdiagnosis that day, because everyone was using the word in a slightly different way. So we all had this general shared intuitive sense that we were all interested in the same problem or similar problems or related problems, but we weren't completely clear what we meant when we said this word, overdiagnosis. So we came away from that meeting really motivated to try to unpack why that could be, why these very well-intentioned, very smart, expert people were not using this word in exactly the same way.
And why is it important to have clarity on that word? What's it stopping us doing, or what conversations can't we have without its definition?
I think overdiagnosis is such a difficult thing to approach in policy terms, in clinical terms, and I find it even just talking with my friends about overdiagnosis, it's quite counterintuitive, and it can be very difficult to talk about in a way that convinces people that it is a problem that we need to do something about. I think if we're not clear ourselves what we're talking about, it becomes very difficult for us to be clear with policymakers and with the general public that this is a problem that we need to do something about. And we also, if we're not clear, I think we potentially waste a lot of energy within the research and clinical community talking at cross purposes. If we're all using the word to mean different things and talking past each other, we waste a lot of energy. But if we can be clearer amongst ourselves what exactly this problem is that we're trying to solve, we've leaped the first hurdle towards trying to solve the problem. And the problem, really, I think the people that are focused on the problem of too much medicine are really mostly concerned that medicine is harming people when it doesn't mean to, and that we're allocating resources in a way that doesn't get the best benefit for the people who need medical care. So it's motivated by good reasons, wanting to prevent harm and wanting to make sure that there's the maximum amount of benefit. But until we're clear exactly on what overdiagnosis is, it's hard to achieve those things that we're trying to achieve.
And what are the key themes that emerge? Because I went to some of your sessions, and you might think walking into the sessions at the conference that overdiagnosis is quite a numerical, black and white issue. But actually, in the setup to this article, you explain that it's actually far more complicated than that. And to an extent, overdiagnosis or too much medicine is in the eye of the beholder. And there's a lot of judgment and ethics and messy stuff in there. Tell us a bit about that.
It's true. So part of the challenge of overdiagnosis is that it's a really complicated scientific problem. So there's amazing people, including my colleague Alex Barrett, who you'll be speaking with later, who've dedicated many years of their career to trying to work out how to produce accurate, trustworthy scientific measurement of the size of overdiagnosis. So it's definitely a scientific problem. But we can't reduce it just to some kind of ideal of value-free science where we just get the maths right and then we know how big it is and then we know what to do. And the reason for that is that overdiagnosis is fundamentally about, or too much medicine is fundamentally about trying to identify the situations in which medicine is doing more harm than good, or medicine is not delivering a net benefit. And as soon as you start talking about harm and benefit, you're in the realm of ethics. You're in the realm of weighing up goods and bads. And as soon as you start talking about harm and benefit, you have to ask, as you said, from whose perspective? So whose ideas about harm and benefit should matter when we weigh up whether to do a particular test or whether to offer a particular drug? Should it be the patient's assessment of benefit and harm, the clinicians, researchers, all of them? If they disagree, how should we adjudicate between them? If there's different benefits and different harms that all have to be weighed up, then how do we do that weighting? So, and that's moral territory, it's ethical territory. So that needs to be a conversation that is quite explicit, and a conversation that brings in citizens, that brings in the public, which is why it's so important to have good public conversations about too much medicine. And if we want to address too much medicine, we also need to recognise that it's a social problem. You know, this is a problem that comes from the social systems that we humans create for ourselves. So it's driven by things like clinicians who are pushed and pulled by incentives and penalties in the systems that they work in, and clinicians who feel threatened by medico-legal threats to do more testing and to make sure that they've covered every base, or companies who are required to make a profit, and so they might sell tests or sell drugs harder than they should to try and make more money, or things like the increasing rise of direct-to-consumer selling of tests, like genomic tests. So, spit in a vial and send it off in the post, and you can get information about your genome sent back to you in a couple of weeks. So these social forces are an important part of what creates overdiagnosis, what motivates it, what drives it. So if we're going to be able to address it effectively, we've got to acknowledge and take seriously that social aspect of overdiagnosis or too much medicine. So the science is critical, but the ethical and social dimensions are just as critical, and in fact should feed into the science if it's going to be good science.
So setting out these definitions must have been no easy thing, and it sounds like there's a huge grey zone in terms of how we're going to be able to think and deal with them. In your article, you've got an enormous table, I guess informed by the opinions of all these different experts who were feeding in their thoughts about what overdiagnosis was. Can you explain for the readers some of the broad themes that are in there?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we tried to do was to get to the bottom of a difference, actually, because when we thought about why those well-intentioned, super smart experts in that room couldn't agree on what overdiagnosis was, we concluded that it was possibly because they were using that word at two different levels of generality. So that some of those experts were using the word overdiagnosis in a very specific way to mark out a very specific concept. And we argue in the paper that this is how the word overdiagnosis should be used, that we should start restricting it to a narrow sense. And that sense is really about the boundaries of the definitions of conditions. So the narrow sense of overdiagnosis, which is the first line in our table, is when a person is diagnosed with a condition, but that diagnosis doesn't produce a benefit for that person. So it's a very particular problem, and it's about rethinking the boundaries of diagnoses, diagnostic categories, and thinking about those boundaries not in terms of can we make sure that we find every case, or can we make sure that we treat every person, or can we leave no stone unturned, but instead it's about thinking what will the benefits be, what will the harms be, how can we weigh them up against each other, how can we be sure that the benefits are likely to outweigh the harms. So that concept of overdiagnosis is quite narrow, quite specific, and it really needs to be. Yeah, it is. It's about when is it a good thing to label this person? So when is it likely to benefit this person to give them this label? And it really has to be negotiated condition by condition, because that decision obviously has to be made in collaboration between the clinicians and the patients and the researchers that are working on that very particular problem. So overdiagnosis in that narrow sense, we're arguing in the paper, should be the only way that we use the word overdiagnosis. And we've adopted the BMJ term too much medicine to encapsulate a whole lot of other problems that are related to but not the same as.
Now look at Extract 2. Extract 2. Questions 37 to 42. You now have 90 seconds to read questions 37 to 42.
Breast cancer is not one single disease, but actually 10 distinct types of tumour, dependent upon a woman's genetic makeup. That is the finding of the largest ever study of breast cancer tissue and could provide more targeted treatment. Our science editor, Tom Clark, is here to tell us more. Tom, it sounds dramatic. 10 different diseases, effectively.
This study is one of the most sort of powerful in recent years to illustrate what new genetic technologies are allowing scientists to do in sort of redefining how they understand disease. And it's a big step towards this idea of tailoring disease treatment to the individual, this idea of personalised medicine, in this case for breast cancer. Nowadays, today, at diagnosis, how serious a breast tumour is largely judged based on how well tests, how it responds to tests for the two particular breast cancer drugs that are available to treat the disease. And this study sort of turns all that on its head. It looked at 2,000 tumours from women in the UK and in Canada. It's the largest study of its kind. And what it found, by looking at thousands of genetic mutations within those tumours, is that, yes, breast cancer isn't one disease, but it falls into 10 very discrete genetic groups. And which genetic family the breast cancer belongs to has a strong bearing on how serious that tumour might be and how well it responds to treatment. For example, one class that they've identified, which according to current tests would be grouped as quite difficult to treat, in fact only has about a 10% mortality rate after 10 years, not such a severe type of cancer. Conversely, another group that they've identified, which would have a sort of fairly positive treatment profile based on current tests, would in fact has a 60% mortality after 10 years, a really nasty type of tumour. More interestingly, another new class that seems to belong to these very lucky group of women whose immune system gets involved and sort of fights their cancer for them, of particular interest to scientists. And as the report's author told us earlier, this should ensure in future that women get the right treatment for their disease.
If it's 10 diseases, it means that they will require different diagnostic procedures, they will be associated with different clinical outcomes, and they will require different treatments. And so it's a big step forward in terms of how we manage women with breast cancer and how we need to not think of it as one or two or three diseases, but a much more complex entity that will require, therefore, more tailored treatment.
More tailored, so less mastectomy, more mastectomy, less tamoxifen? I mean, how's it going to look?
Won't dictate how a doctor, the tools the doctor has in his armoury to treat cancer, but it will prevent, for example, it will help identify those women who've got a particularly nasty type of tumour and make sure they get the right kind of treatment early on, possibly the more radical types of treatment. But it could also, on the other hand, and just as importantly, spare some women very toxic, very expensive chemotherapy that their tumour might not necessarily need. I should point out that they've identified these 10 groups. It doesn't mean these tests will be available tomorrow. They've got to do clinical trials to prove that what they've seen in this study translates into the hospital environment. But Cancer Research UK, which funded the work, and now immediately they're going to start funding trials to look into this. So there's the chance that women who are newly diagnosed with breast cancer will be able to enroll in those studies. I'll just mention one more thing. Looking at all these, you asked about new tools in the armoury. Women, by looking at so many genes in this study, they've identified some quite promising new targets for those, for companies to look at to develop new medicines for treating breast cancer.
Tom Clark. Now, a quick summary of tonight's news at 7:29. A Libyan military commander is taking legal action against Jack Straw following allegations the former Foreign Secretary personally permitted his illegal rendition. Lawyers representing Abdul Hakim Belhaj confirmed legal papers had been served on the MP. Unemployment in Britain has fallen for the first time in almost a year. The jobless total fell by 35,000 in the quarter to February to 2.65 million. The government says the figures were a step in the right direction. Anders Breivik, who killed 77 people in a bomb and shooting attack in Norway, told a court that the death penalty or a full acquittal were the only logical outcomes for his massacre. And Home Secretary Theresa May has dismissed terror suspect Abu Qatada's latest bid to avoid deportation as a delaying tactic. His lawyers lodged an appeal with Europe's human rights judges, effectively blocking the government's attempts to deport him to Jordan.
And still to come tonight.
Court.
In a moment, cameras are allowed in court for the first time to record the sentencing in a murder trial. Is this the start of a revolution in how we view justice? And at 7:38, Inspire a Generation. The Olympic motto is unveiled as the 100-day countdown begins.
That is the end of Part C. You now have 2 minutes to check your answers. That is the end of the listening test.